All right. At this point, I'd like to invite Kennedy Mbeva, who has been working a lot in transnational environmental governance. He's also pursuing his PhD, but he's also a deputy convener for the Africa Research and Impact Network. Kennedy, in your perspective and in your work as a policy researcher, how have you been able to work around issues related to convening, to engaging with power when it comes to sustainability matters?
Thanks a lot, Joel. And I think it's a great pleasure and privilege to be part of this very interesting conversation. And I thank everyone as well for taking your time to join, and I look forward to a very interesting conversation. So I think I'll share a few reflections on the topic of the day. And I think when I consider the proposition before us, I think for me, instead of inviting a very easy answer, it raises quite a number of conceptual issues, which I think I'll just share as a way of reflection rather than trying to provide some concrete answers. And I'll be very keen to hear what other people think about those conceptual issues. So I think in trying to draw out those conceptual issues, I'll try to point to some of the works that I think shared some very useful insights into some of those issues. So I think in particular, I'll raise three conceptual issues which I find very interesting in the discussions on decolonizing in general and decolonizing methods and the aspect of power in particular. The first point I'd like to raise is the point of purpose. What exactly is the point of decolonization? I think it's a very broad question, which of course suggests several answers. If we look at the political realm, then political decolonization is quite straightforward. For example, countries trying to gain their independence, for example, former colonies who try to agitate for the independence from the colonial masters. If you look at the economic dimension of it, of course, there's aspects of economic imperialism, etc. And that would be sort of the purpose of economic decolonization, is trying to remove the colonial aspect in economic relations. But when you look at the issues of knowledge production, I think it becomes quite interesting, and especially looking at the aspect of epistemology, that is how we understand things from a point of research. And I think when you talk about methodology and power, that sort of aspect of purpose raises a very interesting question, and which I will pose as my first question. Is decolonization a means to an end, or is it an end to itself, in itself? And I think whatever answer one reaches, or whatever one conclusion one reaches, I think is quite profound, and it influences how we view the aspect of decolonization in our work. And I think Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatisheni does a very nice job in trying to look at that dimension. And he introduces a very interesting concept of cognitive empire. And Sabelo's argument is very simple, that epistemology frames ontology. That is, how we look at things frames the very thing that we look at. And so the question before us then is, when we want to decolonize methodology, of course, that means you're studying something as researchers or whatever role in research that we hold. So we need to wrestle with the question, what exactly is decolonization itself a means to an end? If it is so, what is the end? If the end is challenging power, then maybe that might not necessarily be the end, because we'll ask, why should we challenge power? Do we necessarily have to challenge power? And if we reach the conclusion that decolonization is an end in itself, then what exactly is that end? So I think that's the first question that I'll pose on the conceptual issue of purpose. And I think perhaps a roadmap can be found to that question on what Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatisheni calls epistemic freedom. Do we want to be free in the way we look at the research objects so that we can engage them in the way that we feel is the most appropriate? Or is that freedom the end that we seek when we talk about decolonization? So I think I'll move to my second point, which I want to raise. The second conceptual point is on legitimacy. And with legitimacy, I think there are a couple of points that come up. When we talk about decolonizing methods in the African context, I think as the facilitator Joel raised, is our objective Africanization, whereby we try to make our methods, as African as possible, thereby making them legitimate? Or is there another criteria for legitimacy that we want to achieve? And I think Ali Mazrui really captured that dilemma in a very interesting way when he raised the concepts of mode of reasoning. That is our totality in the kind of education system where we live, how we grow up, and how that influences the way we think, or ideological orientation. So do we want to completely change our makeup as researchers in terms of our education system, of what we've learned, how we live, how we engage? Or do we just want to shift our ideologies from one kind of ideology to another? And I think whatever approach we take is quite profound and takes us to very different conclusions. So I think the second question to reiterate that I'd like to point is one of legitimacy. What legitimates a decolonized method, and one that engages with power in the way that we think is legitimate? I think I'll go to my last point because I think I only had 5 minutes. And that the third issue I'd like to raise is one of practice. And Mahmoud Mamdani captures that element very well when he talks about the scholar and the public intellectual. And many of the tensions or debates we find, I think, given the introduction that was raised and in our lives as, whether holding a role in a research institution, but also being active in other issues that we care about, there's the issue of balancing the roles or navigating the roles of a scholar and public intellectual. And I think in the way framed by Mamdani, we can understand a scholar as the person who's committed to the academic enterprise. Of course, a very contested way of that scholarship is always framed is in the case of excellence, where excellence is viewed as a commitment to a certain paradigm in our field or in our disciplines. And if you can stick and meet the criteria of that paradigm in the production of the knowledge, then your work is considered sort of excellent, in quotes. But then there's a public intellectual whose motivation is not necessarily excellence, because they question that, but the motivation of that the researcher who's a public intellectual is one of relevance. That is, they want to use the production of knowledge to reach some either political or other outcomes. They want to change something. They want to make knowledge relevant. So as we talk about decolonizing methods and the issues of power, are we talking of it in the tradition of the scholarly sense, where we want to integrate, for example, the analysis of power in the disciplines that we work in? Or do we want to use the knowledge that we produce to effect change in our social settings? So I think those are roles that one would find interesting. And I think in conclusion, I'd reflect on the very concrete case of sustainability and the issue of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I think such an initiative brings together all these things that we're talking about. And I think, for instance, when you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, they're very interesting in two ways. The first way is they're universal, in quotes, that is, almost every country has subscribed to them. And so as a baseline, there's quite a lot of buy-in globally. But what is also interesting is there's scope, they're broad enough such that countries or communities or whoever's implementing the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, can contextualize them. That is, apply them or implement them in a way that fits their context. And there are many other examples that one can draw on. So as we think about our roles in decolonizing methods and the role of power in that, I think in conclusion, as I was mentioning, the questions that arise are quite profound, and I'm very curious to hear what others think about it. So I think I'll leave my interventions there. I'm happy to pick up some of the points in the Q&A. So thank you very much, Chair.
Thanks, Kennedy, for that opener. It's interesting bringing in the concept of legitimacy, and whether in the broader scheme of things, when we talk about power and when we talk about methods, we want to try and get into the practice space and excel in that